I'll just respond. When it came to the permit, all of the conditions that, and you heard me go through a lengthy list of requirements and hoops that any permittee would have to jump through to get access to our highways. And the primary concerns of the department are the safety and convenience of the traveling public, as well as the preservation of the infrastructure. These loads met all those conditions, met all those concerns. We asked a lot of questions. We've been in this process a very long time. We take our jobs very seriously. We don't rubber stamp anything. Everything is done on a case-by-case basis. So they met our conditions.
Well, I believe I heard a question in there about why ISP. A couple of good reasons. As these oversized loads move down the road, certainly there is a concern about responses by emergency vehicles. Without ISP, these oversized loads have no communication link with emergency services. They would not know that an emergency vehicle is coming from any direction and needs to pass by them until it's upon them, and then a delay will occur. So from a safety aspect, we felt it important to provide that safety link so that we are advised well in advance of a response of a county deputy or through the city of Moscow, a city officer, or an ambulance, or a fire truck. And then we have direct contact with the oversized load foreman, who at that point then we make arrangements to get the load out of the way, so by the time the emergency service vehicle gets there, there is no delay. That has worked for us up on US 12. The plan has worked very well. The other issue for the state police is this. If for some unknown reason these oversized loads have some sort of emergency with them, i.e. someone makes it past the safety zone to collide with it, or it collides with something, the state police is going to get called to come and handle that situation. So we felt it best that, one, we might be there to prevent it, and we have to date with the oversized loads. And two, if in fact we couldn't prevent it, we would be there to provide a couple things. To gain control of the incident and to provide any emergency or medical services required. That's why we've done it.
I think there was one other piece of your question that pertained to this, the adequacy of coverage or the availability of state police.
To date, we've had no trouble providing adequate coverage for the megaloads or the oversized loads that we want to transport through. At this point, based upon the resources that we can glean from, we would have no problem with the plan that I've seen to date. That could change in the future, and if it changes in the future, then we may very well not have the resource to cover it. But to date, the information that we received, we would have the resources to provide that important emergency services between emergency services and oversized.
Okay, did you get all the pieces of your questions you responded to? Pretty good. Okay. We had Scott Emberg. Was Scott wanting to speak this evening?
Good evening, and thank you for coming to Moscow. I'm also from the Lewis-Clark Valley, so I don't live here in town. However, I chair a Scenic Byway Advisory Team for the Northwest Passage Scenic Byway, which the Federal Highway Administration honored in 2005 with the designation of All-American Road, thanks to its nationally significant intrinsic historic, cultural, scenic, archaeological, and other intrinsic qualities. The question pertains, in my area around Cambyi, there are some important cultural and historical resources important to the Nez Perce tribe. And my question to you is whether or not the environmental impacts of this proposal, this proposed undertaking, have been adequately addressed through an environmental assessment or similar document? If not, why not? And if that is beyond...
Are your comments particular to Highway 95 and this route here?
In this sense, is there any assessment of environmental impacts, and do they affect the decision on issuing a permit?
I'm not sure if I understood the question. Are we talking about 95?
Yes.
What part was about 95?
My main question is whether or not there's an environmental assessment of effects. Similar to what Montana Department of Transportation required.
Yeah. There isn't a requirement for an environmental assessment as is the requirement in Montana.
Okay. Very good.
Mr. Huffman, and then we'll go. Okay, come right up there.
I want to follow up on the question about police coverage. Does this mean within the existing payroll, or additional costs being accrued for this?
The citizens of Idaho and the Idaho State Police are not out any costs as it relates to escorting police.
Thank you. I have one question about decibels. What kind of noise is this going to make in the middle of the night?
Both will and the push truck comply with U.S. Department of Transport regulations with respect to noise.
So no additional noise to what the current traffic is on 95?
No additional noise. They comply with any other large transport truck hauling.
As a matter of fact, I live right on Route 95 in the Ambassador Apartments. I have a condominium there. And now, with heavy traffic going up 95, in the night and the day, anytime there's an extra heavy load, the building I live in is like an earthquake. And I just want to mention that building at 122 North Washington, somebody should really check its structural soundness.
Let's get that microphone. Our next written question is to the Idaho Transportation Department. How do you plan to maintain the highway through Moscow when you already have applied for federal assistance to fix highways destroyed by flooding and mudslides, presumably related to impacts of heavy loads?
First of all, we've contacted our materials engineer, our state materials engineer in the headquarters. They're the one, he's the individual who analyzes the effects of these loads as well as other loads and traffic to the highway. He's determined that these loads will provide minimal damage to the highway. They would equate to approximately 2 to 3 chip trucks. Each one of these loads would equate to about maybe an additional or 2 more chip trucks you can see on the highway. They're also going at a slower rate than a chip truck goes through town. So there's no balancing, we would call like dynamic loading, that would impart onto the roadway. So there's actually less energy being imparted into the pavement, into the road. So we don't anticipate seeing any increased maintenance involved through town or from Lewiston all the way up through our district boundary, which is just right in Skyline Drive.
The next people signed up to pose questions or make comments are Marcias Acosti, and then followed by Deborah Bartlett. And while those people are coming forward, let me put forward another written question. This is for ExxonMobil, how do you plan to get under the trees that arbor over Washington Street, Highway 95 through Moscow? And just to supplement that, I had an email yesterday saying no trimming was going to be required, and I heard in your presentation tonight that that will be assessed and likely. So if you could address both of those, please.
I think my original comment was there would be some minor tree trimming. We recently went through Moscow yesterday, and yes, there will be some minor tree trimming required, but we're looking very closely at how we can move the module through on Washington Street with minimal amount of tree trimming. Can we move it from one side of the road to the other side of the road? And as I pointed out on one chart by the hospital, there's 3 trees on the east side of the road that we would move the load over to the left side of the road. Once we're past those trees, then we can move back over to the right side for allowing an emergency vehicle or a personal vehicle that needed to get to the hospital. And then further up through Moscow, there is a couple spots where the trees encroach on the middle of the road, and we have to look at that more closely, especially with late spring this year. It's hard to see the full foliage, and you see the full foliage better, but there would be some tree trimming required.
Okay, do we have the people who wanted to make it? Marcia? Okay. Ms. Bartlett?
Hi, I'm Deb Bartlett. I've been living in Moscow for 20 years. I have family up in Coeur d'Alene, so I spend a lot of time up and down the road. And taking a look at your page 4 on this handout, you said that stage 1 is about 60 miles. That averages, given the time that you said, to about 10 miles per hour. And I'm concerned that leaves about, if you were to give a stop every 15 minutes, that's about 2.5 miles. I don't see where we've got turnouts or even shoulders in some places that are going to give you that amount of turnouts and then a pullover area on the highway all the way up to provide that. That was one question. It's just, I'm concerned about that. You mentioned that there's a bond that is provided by Imperial Oil to the state of Idaho for wear and tear and things, and I'm wondering what that is and how much of it is provided to the cities and to the counties through which you're going to be going. My last concern was regarding something that the gentleman from Imperial said. Your thing on page 5 says that the maximum height is 15 feet 10 inches, but you said that you didn't take the road in Canada because they wouldn't allow you to have rigs that were 30 feet high, and so what's the discrepancy here?
Okay, I'll answer the last question first. The current modules, before we started to reconfigure in Lewiston, were 30 feet high. And so the original plan was to have this dimension roughly 24 feet wide, 30 feet loaded on a vehicle, and when it's on the trailer, about 210 feet long. When we're basing that, that's basically the size of the other 800 modules that we've been moving in Alberta to the site, and that was the dimensions taken. If we were to go back and make a decision based on a lesser height, we might come up with a different answer, but these modules are already fabricated and in Lewiston, so we don't have a choice now but to reduce it to that height to move. Now, a comment on our calculations. There's adequate down here at the bottom of this chart, I failed to mention it, type of traffic clear. What we have here is there's turn lanes, there's 16, there's shoulders, we can use 3 lanes, some turnouts, snowplow turnarounds, etc. There's a total of 44 what we call traffic clearing locations which we can use. When we look at the estimated speed of the module and the traffic, we also allow some contingency, because if we're forced to stop, because even with the peak hourly traffic, you don't get an even flow of traffic. If you're probably aware, you'll get a bunch of cars coming together. In those situations, we'll have to wait at the turnout or clearing to allow them to clear before we move on. And so we have a lot of contingency built in there to make sure that we get to our destination at night. And from our experience on US 12, we had 2 unfortunate incidents on that first night out. We clipped a branch of a tree, and that's why we don't want to do that. That's why we prefer to have a skilled arborist trim trees rather than trim it with the vehicle. And then we had another incident that slowed us down, but other than those two incidents, we moved the module, what we call the test module, down the road ahead of schedule. And so we're quite comfortable with our plan for here. It's based on the same experienced drivers driving the route and saying we can drive at this speed, average speed between point A to point B. And so, yeah, if you look at the total time...
I'm just concerned for people who live along the rural route. What happens if there's an area where, and I know there are areas where it's very difficult to pull off. There's almost no shoulder. And what are the contingencies for getting these people by if somebody has an illness or somebody has an emergency situation?
Okay, for the emergency situation, I talked a bit about that earlier, as well as the turnouts where we can pull the module over to the side of the road to allow the vehicle by. There's also spots where you have driveways with smaller turnouts, and just specifically dealing with the personal vehicle in an emergency situation, as Captain Lonnie Richardson said, if it's a normal emergency vehicle, they will advise us in plenty of time to pull off to a turnout. But the personal vehicle, we have a scout, it's usually about 10 to 15 miles ahead of the module itself. If he sees a vehicle rushing towards him, he can notify it and advise, okay, we have a person in a vehicle that has to get to the hospital. And in our transportation plan, we know where all these side roads are or driveways. And we can say, okay, go up to milepost, whatever it is, park in that driveway, and we'll get the module by you, and then you can proceed on by. That's if we couldn't find a turnout large enough for the module, which would ever be the most efficient way of getting that personal vehicle by.
And is there anybody who's able to answer my phone?
With regard to US 12, we required an insurance in the amount of $10 million, an umbrella policy, which they provided, which covered every contingency. That's what umbrella policies do.
Is that supposed to cover 95 as well, or is there going to be additional money?
What we would anticipate, what I anticipate right now is that there would be, for that, for coming up 95, we would also require that $10 million bond. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we have somebody signed up here, looks like Randy Bauco, not indicated whether he wanted to speak or not, so I'll give you that option. Joanne Bonita would be next, and then I see that Nels and Joyce Reese signed up, but not indicated whether they wanted to speak. No? Okay, Joanne Bonita? Is that you?
Mayor Cheney, maybe just a quick follow-up on that last question too. There was a concern about damage to the city or county facilities. Just as a follow-up to that, these loads initially would travel on a city street down in the port of Lewiston for a short distance, but other than that, within our region here, this load does not get on a city or county facility. It's on the state highway system, so there shouldn't be any impact to the local agencies.
Let's see, I have several questions. One, I understood that ITD, one of your rules for allowing oversized loads was that they could not be divided. And do I understand correctly that that pertained to Highway 12, but now, for some reason, they are divided in half? Does that interfere with your rules? Question one. Question two is, I don't see why Imperial Oil would have the right to trim trees in Moscow that belong to Moscow or private owners. They're very precious to us, and your problems do not constitute an emergency for us. And I was also wondering if you contacted Plummer and the Coeur d'Alene Reservation, Coeur d'Alene tribe, because you're going to be going through their property, or are you waiting like Moscow had to find out kind of in a roundabout way that you were coming through here?
please.
With respect to your first question on reducibility of the modules, for the modules that we are resizing in Lewiston, it is costing us over $500,000 per module on average to do this work, and that starts with re-engineering the structure. Before we can cut the modules in half, we have to put extra pieces of metal, structural steel, so they still hold together. We have to remove some of the equipment, and it goes on. And so our initial estimate was something between 5,000 to 6,000 hours of work, both to disassemble and reassemble the modules, because before we take them to the Curl construction site, we have to reassemble them because it's a bit like a Lego box. Once you have to put them together in a certain fashion. And to date, our experience would be it's going to cost us more than $500,000 a module. How much more, we don't know at this point in time. So is it possible to reduce the modules? Of course it's possible to reduce the modules. Is it practical, or when you look at the cost in the definitions that they have on non-reducibility in Idaho, these are termed non-reducible loads because when they first came in, they're like one piece of equipment set to operate that way. But obviously, if you can put them together from a bunch of pieces, you can take them apart from a bunch of pieces. But it defeats the purpose of what's originally built for, and adds much more cost, and also adds a link to the schedule because we say about 5 to 6 weeks to disassemble and reassemble per module. So that's that one. With respect to Plummer and some of the communities, we've had some of our people talk to cities north of Moscow, to the elected representatives there, and they're aware of our plan. I'm also aware that IDD District Engineers, District 1, did talk to the city people of Coeur d'Alene, and as of yet we've had no request to go and do a meeting like we're doing tonight here in Moscow with those communities. Tree trimming. We have to do some tree trimming. We're going to be working very closely for the trees in Moscow, with the city of Moscow and also IDT, to come up with a plan that's acceptable. Trees Calgary doesn't have a lot of trees, okay? The area I live in happens to have a lot of trees, and my wife takes very good care of the trees, so I can understand your concern on that. So when we trim it, we want to do with a professional arborist. Much like we have to do a bit now, every once in a while to allow existing traffic to go with the 18-wheelers and the chip trucks. So again, we're going to work with ITD and the city to come up with a plan. And we're going to try and minimize it as best we can by plotting the module route. And the real issue here too is how do we go around the hospital so we don't block the emergency access to the emergency entrances to the hospital. So we're going to be working on that.
While Randy's on his way up here, I'll put forward, you come up to the microphone, you might put forward a written question, wants to know how you're going to get the megaloads up the Lewiston grade.
I think I don't have to tell you, it will be slowly. But that's all in our estimated time. Again, the experienced drivers looked at that grade. They've driven it not with the big trucks, but with normal trucks. And they said, okay, we're going to have to put it in this gear, and we'll have to go up very slowly. But again, it's a 4-lane highway. We can pull off to the shoulders, allow following traffic to go by. That's in our time calculations. We estimate over an hour to get up the grade.
Good evening, Nelson and Lamont.
Spell your last name for me. How
Yes.
do you read it?
MONTZ, and 517 East 6th Street, Moscow, 83843. 23. I've learned some things tonight. And I was not as much listening to what you said, but how you said it. And I'm just a little farm boy, but how you said it. The deal's done. That's the way it appears. You know, you painted a pretty picture. You tried to calm these, these citizenry out here. You tried to calm them. You told us a nice story. This is how we're going to go through Moscow. Well, I thought this thing was up for debate. I mean, you try to just condition us to what just might be the inevitable. How you said, no good. Sometimes I wish I would cross the table with you and your lawyers. I'd feel a lot better if I was across the table. I'm sorry, Department of Transportation. I would like to deal with this guy. Listen, you're a nice guy. We love Imperial Oil and Exxon. But we don't love you enough that we won't censor you and try to keep you within certain parameters. This country means a lot to us. We really don't give a rip what you decided in your boardrooms of what our oil company wants to do or don't want to do. I'm just saying, I just wish I had the feeling that there was a decision going to be made and not just a decision of convenience. Because whether anyone likes it or not, we're the bosses. We're the bosses. We may think Governor Otter is a boss or this person is a boss. You're looking at your bosses out in the Department of Transportation. You may have been hired another way. That's where it lies. I wouldn't be in your shoes for anything. Politics is generally done by compromise. As far as I'm concerned, this situation is non-negotiable. I just want to ask you before I leave one question, sir. Moscow, Lewiston, and that highway up there is Plan A.